So it's wonderful to have this session on lessons on safety from the nuclear industry, and I'm particularly pleased to introduce Helen Rycraft, who is Head of Professions and Human Factors and Organisational Learning at Magnox Limited, which is a company that decommissions nuclear power stations. And her background is in a wonderful mix of things, all crucial, I can imagine, to the work that she does. Chemical engineering. She has an MBA and also psychology. Helen Rycraft, many thanks for coming to talk to us.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel like a Monty Python sketch at the moment, in so much it's something completely different. My background, as I've been saying, is chemical engineering. But in my career, I had the dubious honour of starting to investigate events and accidents. And such, I was given the opportunity to expand my knowledge in psychology and business, because those two are very necessary to understand how things go wrong. And first things first, what I am not going to do today is talk about equipment and nuclear power stations, because that's a whole different type of talk. I'm going to be talking about the people who work inside the nuclear industry. I've had the honour of working in all areas of the nuclear industry, both in chemical plants, fuel manufacture, but I'm now actually working for a company called Magnox Limited, who is currently decommissioning the legacy reactors, the Magnox reactors around the country. And I think I would like to say that these legacy reactors that started in the 1950s delivered a lot of electricity over their lifetime, and in a safe way. But someone might want to question me on that later on. So where are we? Just a quick trot through. As I said, 10 sites around in various stages of decommissioning. We have got one site that continues to operate, and that's at Wilver on the Isle of Anglesey in Wales. And we have a lot of challenges because we're changing from being people who look after a nuclear power station to people who are knocking it down, taking out the fuel, knocking down everything that people have loved in their working lives. And that is a challenge in terms of a culture, because if you have spent years polishing the brass, operating the nuclear power station with a lot of pride, to then go forward and ask them to start to rip the guts out of a reactor, you've got to have a lot of appreciation of how you're going to change the culture and the way they look at themselves and their job. But I'll talk about that a little later. I feel a bit like a gypsy because we have 10 sites which are richly scattered around the country on the coast. And sometimes I feel that taking a caravan with me might help. But I've certainly done a lot of bed and breakfasts in my time, and continue to do. And I also work very closely with the International Atomic Energy Authority, not with the guys who look for the bombs, but with a much more extensive program which is assisting all nuclear power operators in the world to actually maintain their standards and operate safely in the nuclear power industry. Let's go on. The biggest wake-up call our industry had was Chernobyl. And I know a lot of you will know these, that will know Chernobyl. I was on night shift when the cloud came over the UK, and it set all the alarms going on the site completely. Now that's something where nuclear power it can't hide, because if something big happens, everybody knows it's happened, because a very tiny bit of radioactivity can be fingerprinted. We know what reactor it comes from. We also, to a certain extent, know how the accident may have happened, just simply by taking a sample. But it quickly became clear that this was an enormous, tragic wake-up call. The number of people who died in that accident simply by fighting the fire, as you can see, some of you will see that absolutely devastating. The whole of the nuclear core is gone. And this picture is enough to send any nuclear physicist into a cold sweat, because this is the melted core. It is called the elephant's foot. That is still there. It is enclosed, it is monitored, it is kept safe. And I was talking to the engineer who now is in charge of decommissioning all of the Chernobyl nuclear power stations, because the other power stations carried on producing electricity. Because in many countries, nuclear power produces the baseline load and, in fact, most of the electricity which they can depend upon. But he is saying now that they've now come to the realisation that they can start to clear up that site. But they're having a lot of help from the entire nuclear industry, because one thing I'd like to tell to you is the nuclear industry shares. We've always shared. We share even more after Chernobyl. Okay, let's talk about more recent events. Fukushima. Chernobyl, going back to Chernobyl, it was the birth of the understanding of safety culture. We moved on from quite early in the 1980s from saying that the piece of equipment broke or he did it wrong. Too simplistic. It was recognised far, far too simplistic. So when we come to now Fukushima, we've got to start asking ourselves some fairly complicated questions. Because all of the reactors across the world are designed to withstand earthquakes. They are designed certainly in certain countries to withstand tsunamis. But this one failed. Its sister plant, which is just up the road from Fukushima, survived. And in fact, all of the other Japanese nuclear power stations survived. But Fukushima had immediate problems with cooling because they couldn't restore electricity to their pumps and their cooling systems, which should have been designed out. We do extensive safety cases. I've heard other people talk in this conference about safety cases in the healthcare industry, where in our safety cases we go to the nth degree to understand the equipment and technology and also the people's role within that technology. What are they meant to be there to do? How reliable can they be under all sorts of circumstances? And even things like earthquakes and tsunamis are designed into the safety case. But we're starting to learn from Fukushima already. All of nuclear power stations across the world have been subject to what we call a stress test. We've gone back and revisited. Are our assumptions right? And in fact, a lot of reports have been given to the UK government and other governments, and in fact IAEA are gathering all those together to check, to say, yes, we're not in the same position as Fukushima was. But we've learnt other things. We've learnt other things like extended time emergencies, how people can cope with working 16 hours straight, having been relieved, management of fatigue, and also post-event trauma. Now in Fukushima, there were 3 deaths immediately. One was a tracked crane driver and 2 workers that were swept away. But the safe havens on site meant that the tsunami did not take the rest of the hundreds of people who worked on that site. But we do have 2 more deaths afterwards, which seemingly are due to post-trauma. So we are now looking very carefully into our arrangements for post-trauma care. But we also are looking towards maintaining our safety culture and looking at what other aspects of leadership and professionalism this event has taught us. I would like to take a moment to say things that you may not hear in the media. In Fukushima, we take our hats off to the workers on that site because their ingenuity of maintaining it as safe as they could be. They went into looking for cars and taking out the batteries of cars so they could run instruments on the site to find out what was happening within the reactor and in the pond cooling. They managed to maintain, if you like, a control of the situation, looking for resources, being very, having the ingenuity to do that under very, very extreme circumstances. They established communications, but lessons have been learnt from that, in so much that some of the communications were a lot more difficult than they expected, certainly in getting clarity of message through to government agencies. But other things are emerging. As I said to you, the cooling sustainability there was hit, and it shouldn't have been. So we're looking at decision making by senior managers as to why they weren't as good as their sister plant. And we're also taking the lessons about oversight. The Japanese regulator have admitted that they weren't paying attention to this aspect for that site. So again, we learn. This is the iceberg. I think you might have seen models like this before, but we appreciate that safety outcomes have got a whole baseline of things that have to go right to be maintained. And one of those is performance indicators. You have to know what's happening within your organisation. Now, yesterday I heard about the difficulties of placing performance indicators into a healthcare system. And yes, we've been there. To the point where we specifically look at our performance indicators we choose to identify what adverse behaviours we might promote and then actively manage. Because performance indicators it's successfully applied, is very dependent on the maturity of your organisation. Indicators in one organisation will give you a good view of what's happening because people are open, people are honest in their reporting of indicators. But if you've got an immature organisation, an organisation that's not quite together yet, you will find that those indicators tend to be a bit skewed. They can even be manipulated. So you need to be aware of what indicators are appropriate for your organisation. And that, of course, gives us a difficulty, because if those indicators are imposed by an external body, then you have to manage that situation. So how do we maintain safety? Now, as I say, I'm not talking about equipment now. We do a lot of design, defence in depth, all of those aspects of, passive safety measures through design such that things will fail safe. But looking at the people, we look at the individual. We look at how experienced they are, what their qualifications and skills are. We manage their roles within the organisation by being clear as to what their capabilities are and also what they can develop into. We do it through looking at team management. We're looking at standards and expectations we set quite clearly to those people, and also the leaders who are part of the team. So the leaders' behaviours, we actually discuss and decide what are we expecting from those leaders. Through the management processes and the choice of procedures and processes are again looking at the impact. Can they actually follow those procedures? I had an input to a national group which looked at rule breaking and non-compliance with procedures and rules. And it's quite interesting that about 80% of all the common features that lead people not to obey rules, bypass rules, break the rules, are common across a lot of industries. That each industry has a little bit which is their own unique bypass features. But if you produce procedures that cannot be carried out and you force the situation, you will find, obviously, it's no big deal. You don't need a degree in psychology to know that they will be worked around. They will be bypassed. They will sit on your shelf gathering dust. And you are in a situation where your procedures you think are good enough and should produce you the reliability, but will not, until they will fail spectacularly. And last but not least, it's through the culture. How the culture is approaching its job, how it sees itself, how professional its image of itself. Practically, we have risk assessments. Now, our risk assessments start way before anybody is sent on site to do a task. We have risk assessments in terms of safety cases, which are big ones, right down to a point of work risk assessment, which the individual does themselves. And that's also important in so much that those who do the task are expected to actually conduct risk assessments and say, no, I don't think we're right here. Start to question whether they have got the safest way of doing that particular task. We're also very much reliant on independent advice because some of our physics that we deal with are not common sense. They're not, you can't, if you like, common sense yourself into that situation. Such a thing is like criticality. Basically, that's where fissile material comes together and you get a massive release of radiation. Well, simply walking into the room because of your water in your body can set off a criticality. So we are very reliant on independent advice to say, don't do that because this will happen. We have standards. Not only external standards like the British standards or the international standards, we have standards inside our company, which is no different from any other industry. But we're very careful to say that we need to maintain those standards. If we say it is a standard, we expect to see it practiced out on the shop floor. And I've talked about management of competence. Last but not least, every nuclear site in this country has what's called a nuclear site licence. And there are 36 clauses to that site licence where we have to have arrangements from the control of materials right through to risk assessments and to the maintenance of competence. But the last one, site licence condition 36, is a very interesting one. It's the newest one that we have in the licence, although it was brought in the 1990s, and that is the management of change. And what it means is that we have to demonstrate we have risk assessed any changes we wish to do to both organisation or equipment within the company. So that's interesting because it sent a lot of managers into, well, how on earth do we do that? But we've developed techniques to actually look at that change may have knock-on effects with this particular skill or this particular running of an organisation. And we have to make the case to the regulator to say, this change we wish to make because, obviously due to changes in the organisation or changes in the way we wish to do business, but demonstrate that we are maintaining a fundamental level of safety within the organisation. Okay. Back in the 1990s, we decided to start to develop our nuclear operators. And now this was countrywide because in those days we had only 2 main companies in the country that had nuclear, or apart from the, sorry, mustn't forget the military, but we only had 2 companies that had nuclear sites in the country. And we had started to introduce what we call behavioural safety. Now this is a peer-to-peer. This is developing, if you like, a safe situation where someone can say, I don't think we're quite doing this right. Or why did you put yourself at risk when you did this? Why aren't you wearing your hard hat? Why are you using the wrong tool? And behavioural safety was introduced quite successfully. We had a lot more difficulties in the States introducing it, so it's not for everybody, it's not for every culture. But we believe we managed to reduce quite significantly our industrial safety problems by the use of behavioural safety. There's plenty of papers out there to read up about it, but as I say, you do have to modify it according to the workforce you have. But it did, if you like, start to reinforce the concept of what we would call questioning attitude. I've heard it in the news in the health area as being candour. But it's a case of questioning attitude, the right of anybody who's doing a task or even as a bystander, saying, hold on a moment, are we okay to carry on this? Why aren't we doing this? Etc. But more importantly, we have got leaders and managers who are also coached in saying that anybody can ask you a question of that nature and you will need to accept it. It is not a challenge to your professionalism. It is not a challenge to you personally. It is an honest question. And it will help you and maybe stop that mistake that you haven't quite seen. And value it. Human performance is another area. We have developed a number of techniques to introduce processes that improve reliability of carrying through a task. And some of those are very simple, like three-way communication, for instance. And very critical tasks, we have the I am doing this, you are doing that, I am seeing you're doing that, and then confirming that you've finished. And it's three-way communication. It's been demonstrated in human factors to have an increase in reliability. So we're using a lot of human factors techniques in this particular area, as I say, to prevent the different types of human error. And we're very mindful of the different types, like error of omission, error of commission, the checking errors. And it's important that we pay attention to that, we don't design in failure to our routine tasks. Even a simple thing, like if you put a valve or you're doing a task at location A, but actually you can't see the indicators from another panel, then it's obvious. You're going to have either them rushing backwards and forwards to seeing what's happening, or at the end of the day, some of them will just stay put and say, oh, check-up later. Okay. And last but not least is our occupational health. Now, I've always worked fairly closely with our occupational health people. We have a chief medical officer who is in charge of occupational health on all of our 10 sites. And simply because where I am concerned with performance and reliability, obviously when people start to degrade in performance and reliability, they can very quickly slip into more the occupational health sides with chronic or acute problems in health. So we tend to keep each other up to date with what's going on in our areas. They also conduct occupational walkthroughs when I conduct, if you like, ergonomic walkthroughs on certain equipment, just to say, well, we're covering, if you like, the environment area and the task area together. And that cooperation has helped enormously in getting equipment right and the task right. Okay, now I had a lot of cynical engineers saying, well, all they have to do is follow the instructions. That's all they've got to do. But when you put it in context, you say, well, you can have the best management system in the world, but if you haven't got the culture or the professionalism in place, then, as I say, they're nice, neat, tidy files on a shelf gathering dust. And just putting to the point where you have a good safety culture but an erratic management system, then sooner or later they're going to fall into a bear trap. Something's going to get missed or forgotten. So they work together. You've got to have both to have the most optimum systems inside your operations. Certainly that's what we've found. We had situations where we found that people were working around the rules because they simply couldn't do it according to what management thought they ought to be able to do it. And it was just simple things like the wrong equipment had been provided. But the culture wasn't supporting them because they weren't, or they didn't feel they could say, well, can we order some different equipment, please? And that's not good enough. You've got to have both. You've got to have the safety culture that's able to have the questioning attitude. They've got a professional approach to their job with a very good management system and processes. Okay. A knotty issue, something that I had to approach quite head-on at one stage, in so much that directors and senior leadership need training too. It's amazing how you go into some organisations and all the training and all the good things that come from that tend to start below the senior leadership, and they haven't thought through what the senior leadership may need. Now, of course, I'm not talking necessarily about leadership who think that they can wear their underpants over their trousers, basically. Because you're always going to come across people who don't think they need training because they've been there, done that, got the T-shirt. But at the same time, when we're in the nuclear industry, we've had numerous occasions where people have come in from outside of the nuclear industry and haven't understood the burden of leadership in a nuclear organisation that they have to pay attention to. It's not very easy to change things in the nuclear industry and the way we do things, for all sorts of reasons. And it can be a very frustrating time for someone who comes into a leadership position and is being told, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. No, I'm sorry, that's going to take 6 months because we need to redo the safety case for that. And certainly in examples like pulling down a turbine hall, there's numerous examples outside the nuclear industry where a turbine hall has come down within 6 to 8 months. But in the nuclear industry, it can take about 2 years get all the ducks in a row before we start with the exciting pieces of equipment that pull down bits of large equipment. So the leadership is important, and we recognise that leadership is in fact your kingpin. If you can't get that right, then standards, approaches to jobs, professionalism are not supported. Simple as that. We talk about questioning attitude, and the only way you maintain questioning attitude is through the leadership. If your reaction to someone asking a question is, "Why are you asking me that? Go away," it's not surprising they're not going to ask the question again. Now, this has become even more challenging in my company because we are using contractors. We are contracting out a lot of work these days. We're not somebody who has in-house expertise in demolition. We have to buy in. So how do we encourage the contractors and the people who are working who are putting themselves at the point of doing the task, such that they may be used to not questioning because it's not something they do in their company? How do we then say to contracting companies, no, we need you to have a questioning attitude, because if they see something that shouldn't be there, we need to know about it quickly, because it may be something that really and truly another expert need to look at. So that's been a challenge, but we feel that we've managed to do it. The values that I've talked about, professionalism, and this is a little one. This is the one that frightens a lot of managers coming into the organisations, conservative decision making. And it basically means that if you're not certain, or you're feeling that it's not quite right, you stop. You stop, withdraw, think about, pull somebody else in to ask the question. Organisational learning. Organisational learning is something that we're paying attention to at the moment because our existing processes that we have, and we have a lot, and our expectations in the nuclear industry is that we do share a lot, is already under challenge with regard to contractors who, let's face it, their learning is their competitive advantage. So why should they share certain things with us or with any other contractor? And that is one of, if you like, the conundrums of contracting out. So you have to have in place things like contractual requirements that they do share, or they participate in sharing in forums, and also have the processes inside your organisation to make it happen. We use cultural measurement tools on a regular basis. If you like, the thermometer. I heard one talking about a tool yesterday. A thermometer. Where are we? What's happening? What are we maintaining? What are we not maintaining? And also we have a concept called cultural fit. And again, this was illustrated by one of your speakers yesterday, who talked about the McDonnell Douglas case. Now, cultural fit is something that we might not pay attention to quite often, but it can affect how you complete work and how that work is completed safely. Because simply, do we speak the same language? Are we calling a spade a spade? Simple things like that. Are we talking the same when we talk about someone's competence? It's amazing how there's a lot of miscommunication when you make lots of assumptions on the terms people use. And do we expect the same standards? In some cases, it is a precursor to being let the contract that they have to demonstrate that they have a lot of things in place. So we are constrained in who we choose as a contractor to work with. Okay, going back to reporting culture, I'm going to labour this because NASA, one of NASA with their Challenger event, in their investigation, it was a case of, the second kick of the mule is not sensible. And if we have repeat events, that is when our regulator gets very twitchy and starts to say, look, we could be prosecuting you now because you haven't learnt from that same event. But approaching this, if you approach it properly, it shows that you do want to learn and that you don't want to keep things under the carpet or hidden. It can be a way an organisation shows trust and commitment to employees. If you are treating it as, well, that shouldn't have happened, let's have a look and see what can we do better, what can we fix. It's much better than just doing what we call blamestorming, where you're trying to find where there's the buck stop. It also allows an organisation to develop thinking and a responsive workforce. In other words, if they are picking up things like near misses, particularly near misses, where they're sharing it and they're saying, this nearly went wrong, but this barrier stopped us from having that event. It gives you two things. It tells you where you are at risk and what can you do to prevent that risk being realised. And it also shows you what barriers are working in your organisation, what you need to preserve. But more importantly, leaders can benefit from it because it shows that you're trying to solve the real problems as opposed to soapbox ideas. It's amazing how you can have an event that occurs and somebody somewhere say, oh, well, I know why that happened. It's that. We'll fix that. Well, that's not very scientific, I would like to say. You need to actually look at it a little bit more carefully than that to find out, are you fixing the right problem? There's no point in having the same accident happen or incident happening 3 or 4 times just because you're fixated on one solution. And I've seen that happen. Now, I had calls to take part in a piece of academic research with Bristol University, looking at common lessons inside major disasters and accidents. And it's amazing how common some of these factors come up. And that is to do with things like Texas City, it's to do with the recent Deepwater Horizon. It was historically around about 20 to 25 major disasters and accidents that we looked at. And we found common hits. We found precursors like maintenance of competence, the application of acceptable standards. All these industries had standards, but the important thing was, were they actually being applied? The questioning attitude I've talked about, because it's amazing how many people, it's most depressing to go into investigating the event to find that you've got people sitting in front of you saying, well, I knew it would happen because, and saying, well, why didn't you say? Well, it's not my job, is it? Or, well, you should have realised. So, as I said, the questioning attitude is a very important aspect. Organisational complacency, the loss of focus. It's amazing, again, performance indicators, if you come out as the best 2 or 3 years running, it's amazing how rapidly you set yourself up for a fall because you start losing. You start thinking, oh, well, we're doing that fine, we're doing good. And you rapidly drift into what's called unconscious incompetence, if you know that cycle. You go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, to conscious competence to unconscious competence. And it's a very short nudge to be right down at the bottom of the tree again. And that is something that we certainly look at. And we call it organisational drift, where standards gradually slip. And that's because you think that you're still performing well. Loss of oversight, poor communication. Management of change I've covered, because we saw where industries went through massive change and hadn't really done, if you like, their risk assessment of the changes they were introducing. And the saddest of all was between the 2 shuttle accidents, where they designed NASA to cater for all the things they had found in the first accident, and then systematically dismantled them until they had the second accident. And structural external pressures, well, that is speak for politics, I guess. Politics that intervenes and is not managed. So what I would say to you is, what I've found when I've looked at events and accidents and these incidents is that you peel back an onion. And if you've got systems there to actually look at local lessons, that's great, because you can fix things. People understand it, relate to it. And you're open and you're saying, we want to fix this, that's great. But sometimes you'll come across events where you say, well, actually, this has got a bit of a wider aspect, and we need to look at that a little bit more. The management systems didn't help here. It set them up for a fall. And of course, even bigger than that are cultural lessons. And certainly for Chernobyl, we had that as an issue, because the way that Chernobyl had been structured led them to the failures. Safe working. We have a lot of challenges at the moment within the nuclear industry. As you may or may not know, in the last 5 to 6 years, companies have been broken apart, networks and systems have been broken apart. So we're trying to hold together, if you like, a workforce that can maintain its professionalism. And it does. But we're very focused on the fact that you can have all the theories and models and management speak and whatever you like, but you must go back to the front line. What is the reality? Don't make assumptions about somebody going into an area or doing a particular task. You have to know, because then you can only have properly designed processes and procedures that can deal with the reality of the workforce, what the workforce is facing. As an industry, we do a lot of sharing, as I said. In this country, I share and are a member of the Energy Institute, which is mostly offshore and chemical plant, because we have a lot of commonality. And sitting listening to a lot of the presenters here, I'm saying, yeah, that's common to us. We've looked at that. We can learn from you. And I'm not ashamed to say that you can probably come to us and we can share things as well, saying this is how we dealt with that. And the IAEA and worldwide, INPO in particular, is an American organisation that documents lessons and standards for sharing across the nuclear industry. And finally, just to allow you to wrap it up, in the nuclear industry we try and build into the design, the work, the management processes, the human factors. We try to build in human reliability in the way we approach tasks, and equip the people doing the task with understanding their own aspects of reliability. We are very conscious about leadership behaviour, and we are quite clear as to what we expect our leaders to do. And we expect our leaders to sustain the other processes in terms of design and the reliability aspects. Cultural fit, you must pay attention to cultural fit, because we're bringing in a lot of different companies and different conglomerates. And Buncefield illustrated this. The explosion at Buncefield in the oil industry showed that multiple companies, if they don't have same expectations, it will soon lead to sort of communication difficulties, and certainly at the front end, at the sharp end, things start to drift. And trust is key, because the working relationships are important. Now, I know we have titles of some people saying supply relationship manager, and some people smile with that, but it's important. It's appropriate professional relationships with the people who are doing the work for you. And Deepwater Horizon had a lot of lessons in that, because they had an inappropriate relationship with some of their contractors. And certainly having appreciation of their professionalism is one, but on the other side it is, are they maintaining the standards you're expecting? So that's the nuclear industry. We try to take the human factors seriously, and it's from both ergonomics, which is the basic engineering textbook on the shelf, right up to the cultural aspects, which some engineers run screaming from a room because it's just so fluffy they can't cope with it. But it's important. And supporting subcultures like your peer groups, like your specialist groups, like we have health physicists who are a very defined profession. We have industrial safety people who are very clear on their expertise, occupational health. And it's the respect across the different professions which also keep us working together and understanding each other's area that needs to be paid attention to keep people safe. So that's the nuclear industry, and I wouldn't say that we're perfect because we're not. We're an industrial sector who recognises that if we have an accident, it impacts on the world nuclear industry. It's not a local matter. And as we said in Fukushima, we want to help to ensure that we understand and learn from it. We certainly learnt from Chernobyl, but I would prefer not to have, if you like, the accidents to learn. I would prefer to learn from looking at what goes right when we do it. So, thank you for your attention, and I'll stop now and let you ask questions. Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much for that very really intriguing, the parallels between that and some of the health challenges we're facing. I was particularly struck by the fact that you said you share, and especially since Chernobyl, and it seems to me that in a very minor way relative to that, mid-staff in the NHS of England is kind of like a little mini nuclear catastrophe. But the sharing could have gone the other way. People could have kind of clamped down and tried to protect their own reputations. And why did it go that way and not the clamp down way?
Because you make it safe for them to share. I know that sounds strange, but if they feel they're going to be pilloried and they are going to have the fingers pointed at, there is a concept which I haven't shared, which is called just culture, which is something that you'll find in other books on human factors, which is you cannot give a no blame and say that nothing will happen if there's a really bad accident. But you can do a just culture. You can give the confidence to people to share, to say that you will not be the scapegoat. We will examine what we could have done. And once they see that in action, and you do it in all things, not just big things, in all things, then they become more confident in that sharing.
And the other thing I think resonated in terms of some of the health challenges was this business about maintaining professionalism at times of great stress.
Yes.
And with external factors, perhaps politics or whatever, eroding that professionalism.
Yeah.
Have you any thoughts further on that? I mean, you talked about leaders trying to maintain that professionalism, the need to keep in touch with the front line.
It's the respect of the leaders for the different professions that they are dealing with, and then the strength of how you support the peer group of that profession. We find that where we have a strong peer group, people who feel things are slipping or not going right can use, if you like, the group to agree that, and then have a bigger voice with the leaders. The leaders cannot ignore a group of professionals. They can ignore maybe one person, but they can't ignore a group.
And what's the average professional lifespan of a leader at the top of the nuclear industry?
When I came into this industry, the life of a top leader in the nuclear industry was about 10 years. I guess it's around about 2 to 3 years now, if at maximum, if that.
And do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, that contraction?
It has two sides. It's a bad thing in so much that nuclear industry, in many cases, has to have a long-term view to move, whether you're operating or whether you're even decommissioning. I mean, we are decommissioning sites for 20, 25 years plus. And in fact, the buildings we are building to maintain, if you like, the waste have got to be there 150 years plus. So somehow the leaders who are going to be there for 2 years have to continue that progress. And the plans and the strategies tend to stay, the leaders change. One note of caution there is that we are very vulnerable to political change. And politics tends to, I've been through a period of time where the strategies change from week to week, and it's unsustainable in our industry to have things changing from week to week, because people just sit back and say, well, I'm not doing anything until I know what I'm meant to be doing. It's as simple as that.
Sounds familiar. Given that there are people in this room who may be at that level of leadership where their half-life in their current job may be a year or 2 years, what would your advice to them be with that political climate, how they can, try to bring in the long-term thinking in the context of this rapid change?
Yeah. Again, having the strategy very clear and being very clear on the benefits of that strategy, not only to the operation as such of the organisation, but to particular individuals and to stakeholders. So if you spell out quite clearly what benefit is going to have either to political leaders, because they can say what a wonderful chap they are in encouraging this or whatever, or you have saying that we will be able to deal with a problem or an issue for them quickly and sensibly. It's to do with benefits. What's the benefit to me? What's the benefit to the politicians involved? And don't expect it to be self-evident, because it often isn't.
And finally, a big issue for healthcare is human factors, and that's key to a lot of what you've been doing, and the designing of human factors into the systems from the start. I think that's something that healthcare, is perhaps late in the day beginning to really talk more about. What would you say were sort of the one or two lessons for any organisation that is just beginning to grapple with human factors? How would they start? What might be the one or two things they could do in the next sort of 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, the basic understanding of how people make mistakes. There's plenty of very, very good books now from people who have studied it from academia, but also people who've seen it in industry. And they're eminently transferable into a medical setting. I've seen recently where you've taken some Formula One type tips on reliability into a post-operative transfer care. And there are a lot of other examples out there which you can make the jump and say, well, actually, that reliability would help. I mean, the three-way communication thing, I taught a local mountain rescue team to use it for when they were taking casualties off the mountain, because they wanted a way of having a reliable communication when the wind and the rain and everything else was going on behind them. And there's a lot of transferable knowledge out there in human factors.
Helen Rycraft, thank you very much indeed for a marvellous talk.
Thank you.